Thank you, Erin. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Before we get into the actual webinar, I wanted to take some time to provide you a little overview of ultra-electronics forensic technology. Many of you may know us more commonly by forensic technology, or FTI. Ultra is a leader in ballistic identification technologies. Our IBIS product was designed to provide investigative leads through the ballistic matching of fired cartridge case and bullets. When networked, IBIS is able to link cases regionally, nationally, and internationally. With over 25 years in the market, our IBIS product has been deployed in over 70 countries and provides thousands of investigative leads to law enforcement agencies, which includes the alcohol, tobacco, and firearm and explosives, which is one of our main customer base, where IBIS is an instrument that's used throughout the U.S. as part of their NIBIN program. Ultra also offers comparison microscopes for comparative analysis and document examination systems for both the forensic and security segments. You'll notice as we go through this webinar, we'll be focusing on grants and funding opportunities as they pertain to the reduction on firearm violence, but all the information being presented is equally valid within all disciplines, and the content being addressed can help you and your agency seek funding and provide assistance for grant writing for everybody. On that note, I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I'll start introducing our two main speakers. So our presentation will be broken up into different speakers. Our first speaker is Karen Ziegler. Karen has nearly 30 years of experience in criminal justice program administration, budget and finance, and a full life cycle grant management. She recently retired as the Deputy Director and Chief Financial Officer of the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission, the state administering agency for the U.S. Department of Justice and state criminal justice grants, where she was responsible for the acquisition, the subaward, management, and reporting of over $50 million in federal, state, and nonprofit grants. In addition to financial management, Karen managed the Arizona Project Safe Neighborhoods grant program. She has a bachelor's degree and master's degree in public administration from the Arizona State University and is also a certified grant writer. We're very lucky here at Ultra to have just begun working with Karen, and she'll be working with us as our funding consultant moving forward. Our second speaker today is Pete Gagliardi, and Pete is the Principal Officer of Triple Barrel Strategies. Pete has over 46 years of experience extracting useful investigative information from crime guns and relative evidence in both the public and the private sectors. With 16 of those years, he served as a Senior Vice President with Ultra Electronics, and 30 of those years were in law enforcement, most of which was focused on the investigation of firearms and explosives-related crimes with the United States Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, where he served as ATF's Principal's Liaison to Congress, the Deputy Assistant Director of Science and Technology, the Deputy Assistant Director of Law Enforcement Programs, and the Chief of Strategic Planning. In 1999, Pete retired from ATF as a Special Agent in charge of the New York Field Division. So I think we have some great speakers lined up, and without further ado, I want to pass the mic over to Karen, and she'll get the presentation started.
Thank you, Stacy. So this is the agenda that we're going to follow for today's webinar. First, Pete's going to give you an overview of gun crime solving strategies. Next, we'll review how to search for funding opportunities and some helpful resources. Then we'll get into the meat of the presentation and talk about reviewing the solicitation, developing the team and the timeline, writing the actual proposal, and submitting the final product. Last, we'll wrap up with some grant resources to help you search, review, and write grants. Okay, let's get started. Pete, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the privilege of your time today. So, a brief gun crime overview. Look, firearms have a legitimate place in our free society today. However, their misuse in crime can result in severe social economic impacts on our neighborhoods and on our neighbors. And on the next slide, the cost of crime is estimated to range between the millions and billions of dollars. And I've identified a couple of sources there for later use. But in addition to the obvious social impact, look, entire communities are often impacted. Businesses leave, jobs disappear, property values fall, the tax base erodes, and while the demand for police and emergency services increases. Now, on the next slide, I think we need to answer why. Why do we investigate gun crimes? And as a consultant, I speak to a lot of groups, and I ask them that question. And what I've done is list the general consensus of 3 answers I get in every workshop. 1, to seek justice for the victims and the perpetrators. 2, resolution for their loved ones. And 3, to help restore a sense of peace to their neighborhoods. Now, the investigation of gun crime, I'll go into it a little more on the next slide. Investigations run on information. Information is their fuel. Evidence powers prosecutions. And if you consider the 3 phases of the investigative cycle and the graphic on the screen, you have the first phase, you respond and collect information and evidence, you respond to the crime. The second phase, you take that information and evidence and you run it through another cycle of extracting additional information. Maybe that's from the evidence. Maybe it's from an intelligence, a resource pool. You analyze it, you turn it into something more, and you pass it into the next phase, the identification, pursuit, and apprehension of the violators. Now, as information runs between one cycle and the next, there's a chance it could fall through an existing gap. And what causes gaps or are things like lack of policies, lack of standard operating procedures. Now, new policies, new standard operating procedures, technology can help bridge those gaps or at least narrow those gaps. The wider the gaps are, the more information falls through the cracks. On the next slide, a wealth of information exists generated from both inside and outside of every gun. On the inside, for example, you have the ballistics data. And these are the unique markings that transfer to the fired bullets and cartridge cases during the discharge process of a firearm as they come in contact with certain surface areas of that firearm. The inside data can help you answer the question, what crimes was this gun used in? And specifically, I'm talking about the technology in the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, NIBIN. NIBIN is a database of ballistic images from crime scenes and from test fires from guns that have been seized by police for investigation. You can link crimes to crimes, you can link guns to crimes. The inside information answers the what question. On the outside, there's a wealth of information. Make, model, and serial number. So important for crime gun tracing to trace the history of firearms transactions of that firearm from the point of manufacture or importation right through to the first retail purchase. And sometimes, just sometimes, knowing the first retail purchaser can lead you to the actual shooter. Sometimes it can lead you in one hop or 2 or 3 hops across the pond. Does it work every time? No. Does it work enough to make gun tracing an absolute necessity for crime solving? Absolutely. Also on the outside of the gun, you have the opportunity to collect DNA, fingerprints, trace evidence such as blood, hairs, and fibers. One click, Karen. Unless you have a policy and procedure in place to well manage the information from inside plus outside the gun, you'll never know the whole story. If you start to make trade-offs, you will start to deplete your investigative senses. The takeaway from this slide is the inside plus the outside equals the whole story. Now that all seems pretty easy and straightforward, but on the next slide is where things start to get a little more difficult. Crime solving today requires a proper balance of people, processes, and technology. Just like the legs of a three-legged stool, they all must be in balance in order for the stool to function as designed. If we've got too many processes and that leg is too long, the stool falls over. If we have not enough people and that leg is too short, the stool falls over. Now, technology sometimes can help us balance that three-legged stool and get all those legs in balance so that it could support the weight it was designed to hold. On the next slide, what we're talking about here is people thinking and acting together, executing efficient processes, most importantly driven by sound policies. Technology can help people sustain their processes, speed them up, make them more timely and effective. Next slide. In terms of policy, I think policy is probably the most important thing. Unless gun crime has been made a priority in a particular location by the policymakers and administrators, it seems as though nothing else seems to move beyond that point. The International Chiefs of Police in 2012 adopted a resolution stressing the importance of prosecutors, law enforcers, and forensic experts sitting down together to collaborate on the design of mutually agreeable protocols best suited for their region that will ensure the collection of the information from inside and outside the gun and ensure that it gets extracted and analyzed as it should be and passed on to the investigators so that they can identify, pursue, and apprehend the violators. The list that you see on the screen is from the second page of that resolution, and it shows 6 bullet points for which you should consider adopting a protocol for. The thorough investigation of each gun-related crime, including the safe and proper collection of all crime guns and related evidence, should be a policy, as well as the performance of NCIC transactions to enter guns as recovered and search them for stolen. The timely and comprehensive tracing of all crime guns through ATF and E-Trace. This is the information outside the gun, make, model, serial number. The timely processing of crime gun test fires and ballistic evidence through NIBIN, the inside the gun information, as well as policies that ensure that the DNA will be collected, latent fingerprints will be searched for, and trace evidence as well. Lastly, there should be policies and procedures in place for relentless follow-up, for the generation, dissemination, and investigation of the evidence derived from the previous protocols I've just described. Next slide. Just recently, the major city chiefs and the Police Foundation published a report in which they surveyed local law enforcement police chiefs as to the most useful violent crime tools and assistance that they felt they could get from the federal government and law enforcement partners. NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, and crime gun tracing that can both be provided to local law enforcement agencies by ATF were cited as the 2 top resources that the chiefs felt were available to them today to fight gun crime. Next slide, please. People, processes, and technology. It all takes money. The more hopeful message here is that there is funding available. And now I'll turn this over to Karen to tell you what that is and how to get it and make grant writing easy. Karen?
Thanks, Pete. Okay, let's first talk about some funding opportunities and some resources. Everyone is aware that there's a new administration in town at the federal level. But what does that mean for grants from the federal government? There's a lot of speculation out there that with budget cuts, the grant funding could be reduced. There's others that believe that with the new administration, that funding could be pushed down to the state level and grants will be made available through block grants to the states. But no matter what side of the aisle you're on, we all want the same thing. We want funding for our projects. So what does that mean for criminal justice in the new administration? What we do know is that this current president is a strong supporter of police. So that's a good thing for your law enforcement projects. The president has also said that technology and infrastructure are a priority. So start thinking about how your project can support the administration's priorities. But there's a lot more available than just federal grants. So let's talk about some different types of grants that are available. First, federal grants. These are what are most important or most familiar to us. But there's a couple different types of federal awards. First, there's a grant. In a grant award, the federal government awards the recipient funds and has little interaction or influence over the project. However, there's also cooperative agreements, and in those cases, the federal government partners with the recipient and has an active role in how the project is implemented and managed. Next, there are state grants. State grants can be passed through funds from the federal government to state administrating agencies, like we talked about, or they can, and then they're subawarded to the state to eligible recipients. Each state has an SAA for specific types of grants: public safety, health, education, etc. State agencies may also get funding from legislative appropriations or special revenue funds dedicated to a specific purpose. Look up your SAA in your state and see what kind of programs they fund. Other governments like cities and counties also have grant programs. For example, in Arizona, we have anti-racketeering funds, or RICO funds. The county attorneys administer these funds, and in some of the larger counties, they actually make grant awards to local agencies and nonprofits. Tribes are also a good resource for grant opportunities. Many tribes award grants to law enforcement using proceeds from their Indian gaming revenues. Foundations can be an excellent source of grant funds as well. There are hundreds of foundations ready to give you money. Last, look at private funders and corporate grants. Walmart, Petco, and many large corporations grant funds to their communities. But for all of these sources, look at the mission of these organizations before you invest in writing a proposal. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. So now we identified several types of grants. So now let's look where to go to find them. For federal grants, grants.gov is the one-stop shop for federal grants. You can search, apply, receive notifications, and get everything you need to know for the grants.gov from the grants.gov site. The U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance is another good site. If you're looking for specific criminal justice grants, BJA has a funding page of current opportunity. PoliceGrantsHelp.com is a website that's supported by Police One magazine and is a great resource for law enforcement specific grants. As we mentioned, the SAAs, the state administrating agencies, they'll list many of the grants at the state level on their website. So there's a state administrating agency in every state, so look them up. Foundation websites are also a good resource. Look at foundationcenter.org to do some search for foundation grants. There are many search engines out there, and they're all pretty good, but find one that you can filter so you're not receiving 100 different emails for grants that you're not interested in. One thing I would like to do is encourage everyone to think outside the box when you're searching for grants. For example, gun violence has been deemed a public health issue. Look at public health grants through the Department of Health and Human Services to help fund your crime reduction strategies. You may have to partner with another agency, but it's a win-win for both of you. And also, the funder will appreciate your innovative approach. Okay, here's a little grant humor before we get into writing the proposal. Funders sometimes think that proposals are too broad or irrelevant to their mission. And so in this case, the funder is going to the researcher is going to the funder and say, my project is simply this. I want to find out once and for all if there's any truth in the belief that money can't buy happiness. So we're going to learn how to be a little bit more specific in our grant proposals. So before we get started, I'd like you to answer the following question. How would you categorize yourself as a grant writer? A beginner, an intermediate, or an experienced grant writer?
Great. Karen, the poll is open. We are receiving votes right now. We'll give people about another 15, 20 seconds to respond. We're getting a lot of great votes in. We're at about 70% of the audience right now. And we'll close it out in about 10 seconds or so. Karen, just while we're waiting for the poll to close down, what kind of difference, what do you recommend for beginners versus some of the more experienced folks?
As far as grant writing or grant researching?
Yeah, just in general. So we do have the votes in. 82% of the audience indicated that they consider themselves beginners, 14 indicated intermediate, and 4% indicated experienced.
Great, thanks, Erin. And that's real helpful as we go through the rest of the presentation. The vast majority of our audience are beginners, but I think there's going to be some really good information for every level of grant writer. But I will keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the slides. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is review the solicitation. The first thing I want to say is read this several times. Take a highlighter, mark key sections and requirements, and read and reread that solicitation. Most solicitations at the federal level are about 40 pages long, so it takes a while to get through it, but it's really important that you know what you're applying for. Before you put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, make sure you are eligible to apply. Eligibility is usually right at the beginning of the solicitation. We'll take a look at a current announcement here in a minute and show you what to look for. The solicitation usually will include the program purpose or agency mission. This is the funder's mission, not yours. Your project should align with the mission or purpose of the funder. Think of it this way. How is your project going to help the funder achieve its goals? And that's kind of a different way of thinking from the grant writer. We're always thinking that we need to present our project and our mission and goals, but what we need to do is make sure we're tying that to the federal funder's mission and goals. Next, look at requirements for collaboration. Is a 2 or more agency partnership required? Or are they looking for a regional approach to a project? Is it multidisciplinary? Meaning, are you required to have law enforcement and community organizations as partners? Or in an earlier example, law enforcement and public health. If it's not required, is it preferred? These projects will receive higher consideration from the funder because they are innovative. Funders like to see regional and multidisciplinary proposals. Also, is a research partner required? Like the Project Safe Neighborhoods grant that we're going to take a look at in a minute, your project must have a research partner and you must allocate a specific amount of the budget to that partner. Don't let this requirement scare you away from applying for these grants. We'll talk a little bit more about research and evaluation later in the webinar. Are there matching or cost-sharing requirements? Is this an in-kind or a hard cash match? Make sure you have the resources to meet the match requirement. This sometimes takes prior approval before you submit, so make sure you're planning ahead. Check out the scoring criteria. Most solicitations will publish how they allocate points to each section of the proposal. This is important, especially if you're crunched for time. Don't spend all your effort writing a section that's only worth 5% of the total points available. Focus on the areas that carry the most points and make sure that they are solid. Terms and conditions. Yes, I know this can be dry, but hang in there with me for a few minutes. Make sure you can meet the requirements in this section. Federal grants have strict civil rights requirements that require you to designate a civil rights point of contact. They also require you have written policies to handle complaints. So make sure that you have those in place before you apply for these kind of grants. Also look at technology requirements. Many technology awards will require you to be compatible with certain technology standards such as NIM, the National Information Exchange Model. You have to make sure that you can verify that you can meet these requirements. Also, page limitations and formatting. This may seem petty, but as a grant reviewer, I'm telling you that this is really important. If you can't follow simple instructions in the solicitation, then how are you going to be able to manage a project? If the solicitation says 12-page maximum, 12-point font, and 1-inch margin, just do it. Last, the due date. Mark this on your calendar, highlight it, write it on your forehead, write it on your coworker's forehead. Make sure you have the necessary time to submit the grant application. Okay, let's take a look at the Project Safe Neighborhoods current grant solicitation. And of course, this worked perfect in the testing environment, and now it's going to take a minute. Okay, we're going to try it a different way. Aaron, can you see that screen okay?
Yep, I sure can. Looks great.
Here we go. So this is the Violent Crime and Gun Crime Reduction Program, Project Safe Neighborhoods, the 2017 competitive grant announcement. As you can see, the application is due March 28, 2017. That's next month. Right up front, we have the eligibility. Eligible applicants are PSN team fiscal agents for the United States Attorney's Office and federally recognized Indian tribal governments. Eligible U.S. Attorney's fiscal agents include states, units of local government, educational institutions, faith-based or other community organizations, private nonprofit organizations, and federally recognized tribes. For details on the fiscal agent certification process, they give you a link. And then there's a note that says if an applicant is not a fiscal agent and has not received the required certification, its application will summarily be rejected. So a fiscal agent is an agency that's been contracted with by the U.S. Attorney's Office to manage the Project Safe Neighborhoods grant. Not everyone can just submit a grant for PSN. So if you're interested in the PSN project, I strongly encourage you to contact your U.S. Attorney's Office in your district, or you contact the state administrating agency, and they can explain to you how you can participate in a PSN award. Next, there are several categories that you can apply in the PSN award. First, category 1 is the district populations of 5 million or more. Category 2 is populations of 2 million to 4,999,999. And category 3 are district populations under 2 million. Category 4 are the recognized tribes. So understand what category you fall in and then work with your U.S. Attorney's Office fiscal agent on submitting a proposal. Next, again, we have the deadline of March 28th, and it says that this grant has to be submitted through grants.gov. It's also telling us that you have to register with grants.gov prior to submitting an application. These applications are due on the 28th, but the registration may take a couple days for that to process. So make sure that right when you decide you're going to apply, do that registration early, and then you're ready to go when you want to submit on the due date. So here we have the table of contents for the solicitation. So like I said, there's about 40 pages to a solicitation, so this is real helpful to find your way around. On this page, they talk about the program description. You remember we talked about the mission of the funding agency. This is where you're going to find that information. In the second paragraph, it talks about PSN. They are designated to create safer neighborhoods through a sustained reduction in gang and gun violence. The program's effectiveness is based on a cooperation and partnership of local, state, and federal agencies engaged in a unified approach led by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Also at the bottom of that paragraph, it says that it's based on the 5 design features of PSN, and we'll go over those here in a minute. It says that this program is competitive-based and it's in a competitive environment. So here are the PSN design features. There are 5 design features that says you must address in your application. The first one is partnerships. As we talked about collaboration earlier, you must have a partnership between federal, state, and local enforcement agencies. The second section is strategic planning and research integration. PSN is a strategic problem-solving program based on strategic planning process in which jurisdictions define the specific components of their gun crime or gang violence problem. This is where we're going to talk about a research partner. So in PSN, you're required to have a research partner. In addition to that partnership, applicants must set aside at least 20% of their proposed budget to directly support the partner. So when we talk about the budget, you'll see where we'll build in that 20% for the research partner. Training and technical assistance is another one of the design features. And it talks about some training and technical assistance that's available from the federal level for your project. Outreach. The outreach efforts are community-based prevention programs or faith-based programs that will help your project get those deterrent messages out to the community. Accountability, data analysis, and data-informed efforts. Again, this is where your research comes in. Goals and objectives and deliverables. These are the goals of the PSN project. Again, we talked about the mission and of the organization, the funder. So these are the goals of the PSN project at the highest level. You're going to develop your own goals, but you have to make sure that they're in line with the goals and objectives of the program. The federal award amount. This is important. BJA expects to make 12 awards of up to $200,000 to $500,000 each, depending on those funding categories we looked at, for an estimated 24-month project period. So they're going to make 12 awards. We know the maximum award is $500,000 for a couple of those categories, $200,000 for the smaller category, and it's going to be a 24-month project. type of award. BJA expects that any award in this solicitation will be made through the form of a grant. We talked about grants versus cooperative agreements. This one is going to be a grant. And here in the budget information, the cost sharing and match requirement, there is no match required in this grant. Okay, next we're going to talk about eligibility and applications and submission information. What should an application include? We can see here again in bold, approval certification letter from the relevant U.S. attorney. Do you think that they mean business when they talk about that? You have to have that certification before you apply for this grant. An application may also combine the budget narrative and the budget detail into one. However, if an applicant submits only one document, it must contain both a narrative and a budget detail. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. The application needs to be on the federal SF 424. That is online on grants.gov, and so you just fill that form out. It needs a project abstract, a program narrative, and the program narrative needs to include a statement of the problem, the project design and implementation, capabilities and competencies, and a plan for collecting the data. And we're going to go through each one of those steps here in a few minutes. These are the objectives of the PSN program, not necessarily your objectives, but this is good information because it shows the performance measures of the project and it shows the data that's going to be required by the subrecipient or the grantee. And I hope I don't make you dizzy, but I am going to scroll down a little bit to get to the scoring criteria. And we are almost there. Okay, application review information. Applications that meet basic minimum requirements will be evaluated by peer reviewers using the following criteria. The statement of the problem will be 20% of the total score. The project design and implementation will be 30% of the total score. The capabilities and competencies will also be 30% of the total award or the total score. And then the plan for collecting the data required will be 10%. The budget and detailed project narrative will be 10%. So that gives you a good idea of how your proposal is going to be reviewed. And then we'll go down to the end. This is very helpful. Most federal awards will include a checklist. So you'll be able to check off. Oops, sorry. I overshot. Let me go back up. All right, here we go. Here's a checklist of what should be included in the application. The 424 we talked about, the abstract, program narrative, budget detail, any indirect cost rate agreement you have, tribal resolution, there's an internal controls questionnaire, disclosure and lobby activities, and then a whole list of other attachments that we'll go ahead and talk about. Okay. So I am going to get back to our presentation. All right, hold on 1 second. All right, Aaron, my screen just froze.
Got it. Do you want to try restarting, or would you like me to take over the presentation?
We'll see if... All right, there we go. So now we know what
your screen.
You can see it? Great. Okay. So now that we know what grant we're going to apply for, it's time to set up our grant writing team. First, you want to get a technical person on board. This could be your subject matter expert or your SME, a scientist, a clinician, or a technician, or an IT person that can help you with those technical requirements we talked about. Next is your research folks. This will be your research partner if it's required. But even if it's not required, it's a good idea to have someone that can gather and interpret data and statistics, as well as help you set up the evaluation. If you don't have anyone in-house, reach out to your university, your community college, or your SAA for assistance. Every state has what's called a Statistical Analysis Center, or a SAC, that is funded by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Many of these SACs are willing to help you with your research efforts. Next is the money folks. Get your finance, payroll, and HR folks to help you with costing items needed for the budget. These folks can help with salary, fringe benefit calculations, and job descriptions that may be required as part of the submission. Editing. You need a good editor to help you review your proposal. Trust me, after you've looked at it 1,000 times, you will read what you want it to say. I recommend getting someone that is not part of the project, like your PIO or your communications person, to QA the proposal. If they don't know anything about the project and the proposal makes sense to them, then you've done a good job explaining it. Last is your approval folks. Who has to approve the proposal before you submit? Your chief, your executive director, your CEO? Does it have to go before your city council or another body for approval? This all takes time, so make sure you plan accordingly. So that's a great segue into our next section, developing the timeline. First, create your schedule. I like to start with the due date and work backwards. Give yourself a cushion of at least a day before the due date to submit. Something always comes up, so plan ahead. If letters of support are required, ask for these right up front. Drafting the letters or providing a template that includes the grant you're applying for, a summary of the project, and the relationship you have with the supporting agency is very helpful and appreciative. Remember, they may have an approval process too, so give them some time. Build in time for multiple drafts, especially if you have several people working on your project. It's helpful to create an outline to keep everyone on track. Next, allow time for your budget and your data folks to get you what you need. This grant probably isn't their first priority, so give them some time too. And again, plan time for your approvals as we discussed earlier. Allow time for that final review. A rushed proposal will be noticed by the funder. And last, submit early. If you're applying on grants.gov, keep in mind the rest of the country is applying as well. The system can get bogged down and you may not be able to submit. And also remember that grants.gov requires a registration before you submit. And this can take up to 48 hours, and you cannot submit the application until this step is complete. Think of this as a project management exercise. Document each key step, who is responsible, and when it is due. Keep a shared calendar so everyone can stay on track. And touch base with your team frequently and address any issues right away. Okay, so now let's get started with writing. But before we dive in, I would like you to respond to the following question. What is your greatest concern about writing a grant? I've never been successful in winning a grant before. We have no one with sufficient time to write a grant. The grant is due too soon. Or There are areas of the grant I just don't know how to address.
Great, Karen. The poll is open, and people are rapidly indicating. And again, with this one, you are able to select multiple options here. And we're going to give this about another 30 seconds or so to go. And we'll give just a few more seconds here. Great, and I'm going to go ahead and share the results. And so the results are for the first option, I've never been successful in writing a grant before. 30% indicated that. 38% indicated that we have no one with sufficient time to write a grant. 15% indicated that the grant is due too soon. And 57% indicated that there are areas of the grant that they do not know how to address.
Okay, great. Thanks, Aaron. Okay, well, hopefully this seminar here is going to help with that last group. Okay. So before we get started here, let's look at some styles of writing. We have active writing, passive writing, constrained writing, fragmented writing, rewriting, and persuasive writing. So I don't know if any of you resemble any of those styles, but I certainly did at one point in my career and probably at many points in my career. So keep these general tips in mind as you're writing your proposal. Use active voice and action words. Use simple words and limit the jargon. Break up those long run-on sentences. And keep in mind the reviewers that will be reading your proposal. Be clear and concise. Okay, so let's take a look at what's required in the proposal. As we saw in the PSN application or the solicitation, they would like an abstract. The abstract is usually listed first in the solicitation, but I recommend you write this last. An abstract is just a summary of the proposal, and it's usually published and made viewable to the public. The abstract includes the project title, information about the organization, a brief description of the project, the amount requested, and the goals and objectives. You can see why it's easier to write the abstract after you finish the proposal. All you have to do is take a couple key sentences from each of the sections and put that in your abstract. Next, we're going to talk about the problem statement. Here's where we need to identify the problem. Ask yourself, what are you trying to solve? Collect the data to support your claim. You need to prove why this is a problem. This is where you bring in your research folks. Use local data and make comparisons to the national average or neighboring jurisdiction. I like to use rates or percentages with the actual count, and I'll show you why this is important. If I had 1 homicide last year and 2 homicides this year, I have a 100% increase in homicides. But do I really have a problem? So you really have to make sure that your statistics tell the story that you want it to tell. Next, what are the consequences if we do not address this problem? If you tried other things and they failed, include this in the problem statement. Don't be tempted to talk about how you're going to fix your problem here. Save that for the next section. So here are some good resources for statistical data. Many cities also have their own websites that have crime stats on them. Just make sure that you use reputable sources and cite your statistics. We've listed here the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the Uniform Crime Report under the FBI, and the Justice Research and Statistical Association. That is the association of all those SACs that we talked about. Okay, so after you identify the problem, what are you going to do to solve it? This is the project description, or sometimes called the program design. Think of it as your who, what, where, when, and how. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? Where is it going to take place? And who are the key personnel and who are we serving? When is this going to happen? This is going to be your project timeline. Make sure you're hitting all of these points in your narrative. If you're not real sure what kind of project or program design, there are some really great resources out there to help you. Crimesolutions.gov, under the National Institute of Justice, has a library of evidence-based programs that have proven results that you can use to follow and address your problems. So we have a list here. And don't feel like you need to write all these down. Erin is going to make this webinar, the PowerPoint, available to you, so you'll have direct access to all these links. Next, we're going to talk about goals and objectives and performance measures. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the SMART model. Goals should be specific, measurable, achievable or actionable, realistic or relevant, and time-bound. I like to think of it as an upside-down pyramid, broader on the top and focusing to a point on the bottom. Goals describe the broader purpose, while objectives are more defined. Who will do how much of what by when? And performance measures are what we are going to count or track to see if we've achieved our desired outcomes. Here's an example. The goal is to reduce gun crime and gang violence by employing a research-driven, intelligence-led, and strategic problem-solving approach to reducing firearm crimes and gang violence by implementing a NIBIN program in the state. Pretty broad. But our objective here is that we are going to test and enter all new seized firearms in NIBIN within 10 days. This is what we're going to do, how much we're going to do it, and by when. And then the performance measure is the percent that we're going to enter into NIBIN. This is what we are tracking to show if we've made our goal. Next, we have the capabilities and competency section. This is basically a resume of your organization. The funder wants to know your experience and your ability to carry out the project. Include previous grants that you've received and how the grant was managed. Include positive outcomes from previous awards. Also include your partners' qualifications and experience. And last, include your research partners' qualifications. Remember when we looked at the PSN solicitation? This section was worth 30% of the total score, so don't skimp here. The next section we're going to talk about is the budget. The budget tells the funder how much it's going to cost to run your project. Think of the budget as your financial plan. Typical budget categories are personnel or salaries, fringe benefits, consulting and contracts, supplies, equipment, and other catch-all category. We'll show you an example of a budget here in a minute. Understand what is allowable and what is prohibited under the grant. These are usually spelled out in the solicitation or in supporting documents. Don't ask for things that are not allowable. Make sure your budget ties to your project. Are you asking for items that are not addressed in the project description? For example, are you asking for salary and fringe for 3 technicians while you only said you would use 2 to process cases in the project description? That may seem like common sense, but it also goes the other way. If you say you're going to do all this work in the project description, but you're not asking for funding for that, then the reviewer will not know how you plan to pay for it. Make sure your match calculations are correct. We'll look at some match calculations here in a bit, but clearly identify in-kind and cash match and their source. If you're including indirect cost, make sure you have an approved indirect cost plan. Recent changes to the federal guidelines has loosened this requirement, but make sure you're working with your finance folks if you are going to include indirect cost. So let's take a look at a couple examples of calculating match. This first example is pretty straightforward. It's a 25% match where 75% of the project is supported by the grant and 25% is supported by you. You see the total award is $100,000, $75,000 comes from the grant, $25,000 comes from the recipient. The second example shows a 10% match. This is where 90% of the project is supported by the grant and 10% is supported by you. Notice that in both examples, the match is calculated on the total project cost. It is not a percentage of the total federal, it's not a percentage of the federal amount, it's a percentage of the total award. Okay, now let's take a look at a sample budget and we'll see if we can get this one to work. Aaron, I think I'm going to have a problem with. All right.
Do you have a copy of this one by any chance on your hard drive, or?
I'm having technical difficulties getting out of the presentation.
You might try hitting escape. There we go.
Yep. I can't get out of the presentation. Okay, so we're going to move on. I'm going to, I intended to show you a budget detail and narrative, but I'll just kind of walk you through what you should be looking at. For the budget detail,
if you'd like, we can show off of my show from my screen.
Can you access the budget detail?
Yep, I've got it open right now. I'll switch over to that. All right, yeah, it should be open right now.
I've got it. Perfect. Okay, now you have to drive, right?
Right.
Okay, so get to that second page there where we have the budget detail worksheet. So the first section is personnel or salary. As you can see, you should include, it says name or position. I would encourage you not to include the name, just the position. The computation, you need to say how much the position is going to be paid and the percentage of time that position is going to be working on the grant, and then the calculated cost. So list each one of those positions that you're requiring funding for. Your match is included in this total, so make sure you include those match positions as well. In this example, the narrative is right underneath those positions and calculations. Sometimes it's a separate document. Other times it can be included in the budget detail document. Fringe benefits is the next section. List out each one of the fringe benefits. We're talking about the FICA, the Social Security, any retirement, uniform allowance, health insurance, workman's comp, any other of those fringe benefits that your organization charges. Again, do the computation, how much of the salary times the percent, and then the total cost. The next section, Aaron, go down to the next page, please. Okay, travel. Travel, you need to identify any training that you're going to go to, list the airfare, the hotel, meals. If you have a travel policy with your agency, use the calculations from your policy, or you can use the federal guidelines. Next, we're going to have equipment. If you're going to be purchasing any equipment, make sure you identify that equipment, and the computation, in this case, they're asking for 3 computers, $2,000 each for $6,000. Now for equipment, the federal government has a $5,000 limit here for, or actually a $5,000 equipment policy. If you have a different equipment policy, then you can use that, but otherwise use the $5,000 that the feds allow. So for supplies, These are your office supplies, your training materials, your postage, anything that you need to run that project. And in this example, we have construction. Many grants do not allow for construction. Again, read that solicitation. And then down the next page, consulting and contracts. So if you're going to use consultants, list those consulting companies, what type of service they're going to provide, the computation, and the cost. Now keep in mind that this is an older example. It says that there's a 250 per day that requires additional justification. That amount has been raised. So again, look at your solicitation. And then any consulting expenses, other costs. Other costs are your rent, your telephone, your printing cost. Keep in mind these are direct costs to your project. They're not your indirect. Your indirect will go down in the next section. Okay, if you have an indirect cost rate, you put that amount there. And then this last sheet here is your budget summary. This is really helpful that it just summarizes all the different categories, and it shows your total direct cost, your indirect cost, your total project of $401,710, the federal amount, and the non-federal amount, which is your match. Okay. Okay, Erin, can we switch back to these? Okay. So here's a couple areas where you can look at some budget resources. The OJP Financial Guide lists all of the requirements for federal awards through the Office of Justice Programs. The federal government changed a lot of the guidelines in the 2 CFR 200, and so they have two different guides. One is for grants awarded prior to December 2014, and then the new DOJ Financial Guide is for grants awarded after December 2014. Also, the Office of Management and Budget is a great resource. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about evaluating our project. So why do we need to conduct an evaluation? Well, how are we going to determine if we were successful? And was the return on investment worth the money we spent? In some cases, you'll have a formal research partner, as we discussed earlier. Or you could have an internal research department helping you out. It's important to have good data at the beginning of the project, during the project, and after the project is over. The baseline data is important so you can measure any change as a result of your effort. In a good evaluation process, you should review your data, analyze the effect, and revise your project accordingly. A lot of people have the misconception that you always have to show a positive result. This is not true. Sometimes we learn more from what didn't go so well. So be honest about your results. It will help you and the funder better understand what worked and what didn't. Now we'll talk about sustainability. Yes, we're getting to the end of the proposal and we're running out of time, so this section usually suffers, but almost every grant will require you to submit a sustainability plan. Remember, most grants are seed money. The expectation is that you will continue efforts after the grant is over. So how do you do that if you don't have any money, right? Remember when we talked about making sure you can meet the requirements of the solicitation before you apply? Well, this is one of them. You should have a plan to continue your efforts, even if it's not set in stone. Identify other funding sources that you may be able to use. You could use savings from efficiencies you've realized because of the grant work that you've done, and that can go to fund future efforts. You can write in some ongoing costs to your general operating budget. Do a budget modification. You can submit a new budget request or a legislative appropriation to continue your project. The funder wants to know that you are not going to close up shop once this grant is over. Okay, we're ready to submit the final project. Let's take a look at some of the common attachments. First, your agency's organizational chart. Make sure this is up to date. If you've identified personnel in the project description, make sure that they are on the org chart. This is true for new positions too. Include proposed positions on your org chart. You can indicate proposed positions by a dotted line or a different color, but make sure that those are included and who they report to. Provide a list of key personnel and their resumes. Include those letters of support you've been working on and any MOUs that are required. Include any required certifications. Remember in PSN you had to be the certified fiscal agent through the U.S. Attorney's Office. A bibliography if it's required, and anything else that solicitation requires. Remember when we looked at that checklist on PSN, they had a whole list of requirements that you would have to submit. Okay, here's a few tips as we do the final review of your proposal. First, make sure you tell the whole story. What is the problem? What are we going to do about it? And how are you going to know you had an impact? Use clear and concise language. Use third person. Do not use we and I. Spell out your acronyms first. Then you can use the initials later on through the proposal. Check your spelling and grammar. This is where your editor comes in handy. Make sure all the sections tie together. The project design addresses the problem. The budget supports the project as you described it. And the evaluation is going to show the outcomes of your efforts in your project. Check your numbers. It's common to tweak things at the last minute, so go back and make sure that all those sections are updated in your narrative, in your budget, in your problem statement. It's a good idea to have your data people take a look at that and make sure that those were all written correctly. And use that checklist that we talked about to ensure that you meet all the requirements. Finally, here's some helpful resources as you're writing your grant proposals. The U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistant, the National Institute of Justice CrimeSolutions.gov, the National Criminal Justice Association, and our wonderful host, Justice Clearinghouse, and the Arnold Foundation, which is a foundation that focuses on criminal justice issues. I hope this was informative for all of you today, and there were some helpful tips for every skill level. I'd like to thank you for your time, and now I'll turn it back over to Stacy to wrap up. Then we'll take some time for some questions.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Pete. Both very informative. We really appreciate the time you've taken today and to explain to all these different agencies who are trying to find funding sources. Both your experience is extremely useful. On our end, speaking with all these different clients and working within this market, it's become extremely apparent to us that being in a position to help an agency find a grant or a funding source it has become one of the highest demands we've been asked upon, and responding to these grants is even something more commonly being asked of us. So, I mean, this type of information I think is going to help go a long way. So we thank you very much. In wrapping up, I just want to point out that the presentation and the resource guide has been provided to you. If you look into the handout section of the GoToWebinar, you'll be able to see two icons that you can download. Both of them are available to you. Also, you'll notice our contact information. If you have any questions at all, post this webinar, feel free to contact us directly at the sales.northamerica@ultra-ft.com email address. You'll also notice we've listed our website and our Twitter account, Solve More Crimes. These two sites are two dedicated sites where we provide you with a lot of articles, publications, news stories, a whole abundance of material that we think would be of interest to you and that can really help you when you're writing a grant and help you with your submission. So please feel free to log on to those 2 different sites and use whatever you need. And again, you can contact us if you have more questions. So on behalf of Ultra Electronics and Pete Gagliardi and Karen, I do want to thank everybody who's attended our workshop today. I hope we were able to help you and provide some guidance and some direction. I wish you the best of luck. And Aaron, if you have, I'll hand this back over to you. If there's any questions that maybe are coming in, you can handle.
You bet. And so I would encourage, we have received a number of questions. Feel free to submit your questions through the GoToWebinar toolbar. I will also mention that I did add a 3rd handout upon request. It provides that budget detail worksheet. And then also just encourage everyone to take the post-webinar survey. All right, so Karen, so far the questions have been primarily, I believe, directed towards you. The first question is, do most grants include a standard form to explain how to lay out the budget? Karen, we're not able to hear you. I don't know if, hopefully you didn't get disconnected.
Oh, I'm here, Aaron. Thank you.
There you are.
Yes, you have to take me off mute so I can talk. So to answer your question about a standard form to lay out the budget, there really isn't a standard form, but the Office of Justice Programs has that one sample that they use. And so what I recommend is that you look to the samples that are provided in the solicitation, and as long as you address the standard budget categories of personnel, fringe, consulting, equipment, you'll be okay. And make sure that you give the description of the position, the calculation, and the cost. And then also identify any match that may be required.
Great, thank you. I will make note that we do have a couple of questions coming in asking if there's going to be additional webinars that deal with forensics, and the answer is yes. Keep an eye on it. We're anticipating our next webinar to be in April, but you'll see forensics-based webinars talking about firearms, ballistics, those kind of things, how to investigate those cases, sprinkled throughout the rest of this year. Karen, the next question is also for you. The question is are grants from private sources structured in the same fashion as a federal grant?
Thanks, Aaron. You know, it depends on the source of those solicitations. I think when you look at the federal grant, that's probably the most bureaucratic process. A lot of the foundations and private sources are less restrictive, and also they're less competitive in some cases. So again, you take a look at that solicitation, and if they identify, like we saw in the PSN solicitation, 5 design features, make sure that you structure your proposal to identify and clearly identify those 5 design features or whatever the solicitation is going to request.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can you explain indirect costs from the budgeting worksheet in a bit more detail?
Okay, Aaron, I could do a whole webinar on indirect costs, but let me see if I can give you a simple explanation for that. So you have direct costs. So we have direct costs, which we know are the personnel, the supplies, the costs that are going to directly support the program. But indirect costs are costs that are incurred by an agency that you really can't say are directly related to the project. For an example, your HR person may have to do a recruitment for a new position for your project. The HR person has some dedicated time there, but you're not writing that into your budget. So a lot of agencies have what they call an indirect cost rate, where they lump all of these extra activities and they come up with a percentage. That percentage is then applied to the total award that you're applying for. And then if you do receive the award, your agency's administration basically sweeps that piece of it and then uses it to fund those other costs.
Got it. Great. Thank you. And could you briefly explain the procedure for being approved as a fiscal agent?
So for the PSN award, and there could be some other awards that are like that, but PSN specifically, the U.S. Attorney's Office works with one specific agency to manage the grant. In most cases, it is your SAA, your state administrating agency. And so that state administrating agency will get a certification from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then they will manage submitting a project, working with their local agencies to come up with a project. They'll submit it on your behalf, but the award will come to that fiscal agent, and that fiscal agent will be responsible for the reporting and the reimbursement request and managing the performance measures of that award. So it isn't that any police department or any agency can just say, I want to apply for a PSN award. You have to go through the fiscal agent.
Great, thank you so much. We have time just really for one more question, and the question is how does the amount of funding requested for a grant impact your scoring? And they actually had a print as long as you don't exceed the maximum award amount.
Yeah, and that's a great caveat there. Obviously, you don't want to go over what they say that they're going to fund, but it really isn't about the amount that you're requesting. I know as a reviewer, I'll see applications come in that if the award amount is $500,000, they'll ask for $499,500. For me, that's irrelevant. If you need funding for your project, as long as you can justify the cost and you have a good explanation of why you need those funds, then you can go up to the total, the maximum amount.
Got it. Great. And then the very last question, I thought it was a really good one. Are you able to go through at a very high level the federal grant review process from their perspective, the granting agency?
I can speak from a grant reviewer at the state level, and I'm sure that at the federal level, it's very similar. And so what we do at the state level is we put together a grant team. Our grant team are our subject matter experts. We'll have a technical expert, a budget expert, kind of like what we did with the grant writing team that we talked about in the presentation. So each of us will have areas that we'll review, and we'll score independently, and then we'll average those scores, and we'll talk through any issues that maybe one reviewer had a particularly low score and the other reviewer had a particularly high score. So we'll talk through those issues and see if maybe one of us missed something or read something differently. But once those scores are compiled, then it usually goes to another process for actually allocating the funds. At the state level, the review team didn't actually make a recommendation on how much to fund. It went back to a management team, to decide that. In a federal review process, that may not be the case. They may actually sit through and allocate the funds to each project according to how they were scored.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Karen, Stacy, Pete, I want to thank you on the behalf of the Justice Clearinghouse and the folks that we had attended today for taking the time to share your expertise. We are recording this webinar, and the recording of the webinar will be made available to folks that registered for the webinar. Just stand by for a follow-up email in the coming day. And with that, this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar on grant writing. Thanks again for everyone attending. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.